The case of Alden Crowe is not a story of specters or shadows that creep from the corners of a room, but of a terror that was born in the plain light of day, a horror that nested within the silence of a 10-year-old boy. To understand what transpired in that small, forgotten town in the year of our Lord 1879, one must first accept that the most unsettling truths are often those spoken in a child's whisper, words that carry the weight of knowledge that has no earthly source. This account is not meant to frighten, but to document the quiet and complete unraveling of a family, a community, and the fragile certainties of science and faith when faced with a boy who simply heard too much. If the quiet histories of the inexplicably lost are what you seek, and this is your first time crossing our threshold, consider subscribing to our archive. You will be counted among those who are not afraid to listen. The year 1879 found the Crowe family living in a state of unremarkable peace. Their home was a modest timber-framed structure on the outer edge of a town that had not yet earned a proper name, a place where the seasons, not the newspapers, dictated the rhythm of life. Josiah, the father, was a man whose hands were calloused from carpentry and whose words were few but steady. His wife, Elara, was a woman of quiet fortitude, her days spent tending to the needs of their small home and their only child, Alden. Before the change, Alden was distinguished by a single, gentle trait, a profound fascination with the smooth, gray stones he collected from the creek bed behind their property. He would spend hours arranging them in intricate, spiraling patterns in the yard, a silent cartographer of some unknown territory. This was his one humanizing detail, the memory his parents would later cling to with a desperate, aching nostalgia, a boy lost in a world of silent, ordered stones. The horror began not with a scream, but with a pause. It was a late afternoon in summer, the air thick with the scent of cut hay and the droning of cicadas. Alden was in the yard, engaged in a solitary game with a handful of whittled wooden soldiers, arranging them for a battle that would never commence. The sunlight, filtered through the leaves of a great oak, dappled the ground in shifting patterns of gold and green. Elara watched him from the kitchen window, her hands submerged in a bowl of dough, a faint smile on her lips. It was a scene of such profound and ordinary tranquility that its memory would later feel like a physical wound. Then, it happened. Alden froze mid-motion, his small hand hovering over a miniature soldier. The world around him continued its gentle hum. The cicadas sang their ceaseless song. A dog barked in the distance, but the boy had entered a space of absolute stillness. He slowly tilted his head to the side, his gaze fixed on a point somewhere in the empty air between the oak tree and the woodshed. His expression was not one of alarm or confusion, but of intense, focused concentration, as if he were trying to decipher a faint and distant melody. He remained that way for a full minute, a small, motionless statue in the sun-drenched yard. Elara's smile faded. She wiped her hands on her apron and stepped out onto the back porch. She called his name, her voice gentle, not wanting to startle him. Alden did not react at first. He seemed to be in a place she could not reach. She called his name again, a little louder this time, a flicker of maternal concern touching her heart. The boy blinked, as if waking from a deep trance. He turned to look at her, his eyes clear and calm. He told her he had heard something. When she asked what it was, he simply shook his head and said that it was gone now. Josiah, returning from his workshop, saw the tail end of the exchange. He placed a heavy, comforting hand on Elara's shoulder and chuckled, telling her that boys had worlds of their own, full of imaginary armies and phantom sounds. They both dismissed it as a fleeting moment of childish fancy, a product of an overactive imagination fueled by the summer heat. It was the first and last easy explanation they would ever have. The domestic sphere of the Crowe household was their sanctuary, a place governed by routine and the quiet comfort of shared lives. The floorboards, worn smooth by the passage of years, creaked with a familiar rhythm. A single, well-thumbed Bible rested on the mantelpiece, its presence a silent testament to their simple, unquestioning faith. It was a home where secrets were not so much kept as they were absorbed into the very fabric of the house, becoming part of the silent language of a long marriage. One evening, after Alden was asleep in his small attic room, a conversation took place between Josiah and Alara. It was a hushed and worried exchange, conducted in the low light of a single kerosene lamp at their kitchen table. Josiah spoke of a debt, a sum of money he had quietly loaned to a cousin who had now fallen on hard times and could not repay it. The amount was not ruinous, but it was significant enough to cause a strain on their meager finances, a fact he had kept from his wife for several weeks. He confessed his worry, his voice barely a whisper, admitting his shame at having made the loan without consulting her. Alara listened, her expression a mixture of concern and gentle forgiveness. She assured him they would manage, that his kindness was not a failing. It was an intimate, private moment, the kind that strengthens the bonds of a marriage, its words intended only for the two of them, sealed by the darkness and the sleeping house. The following morning, the fragile piece of their world was irrevocably shattered. The three of them sat at the breakfast table, the room filled with the smell of coffee and fried bacon. Alden was quietly eating his oatmeal, his gaze directed at the worn grain of the wooden table. A heavy silence hung between his parents, the residue of the previous night's confession. Then, Alden spoke. Without looking up, in a voice as flat and uninflected as a stone, he said that Cousin Jebediah would never be able to repay the $17. He said that the mill had reduced his hours again. The spoon fell from Alara's hand, clattering against the floor, with a sound that seemed to echo with the force of a gunshot. Josiah froze, his coffee cup halfway to his lips. They both stared at their son, a cold, creeping dread washing over them. The exact amount, $17, had been spoken in the dead of night, in whispers that could not have carried beyond the kitchen walls. Alden's room was 2 floors above, at the opposite end of the house. There was no earthly way he could have heard them. Josiah found his voice first, asking Alden how he knew that. The boy finally looked up, his eyes holding a placid, almost unnerving calm. He simply stated that he had heard him tell it to Mother. He could offer no other explanation. He did not seem to understand the impossibility of his words, the tidal wave of fear that was cresting in his parents' hearts. They tried to reason it away, their minds scrambling for a logical foothold. They told each other that he must have been sleepwalking, that he had been hiding in the shadows of the hallway, listening. But they both knew, with a certainty that chilled them to the bone, that this was not true. Alden had been sound asleep in his bed. The innocence of his strange listening spells in the yard had now curdled into something deeply unsettling, something that had breached the sacred privacy of their home and their minds. The phenomenon did not remain confined within the walls of the Crowe household for long. It began to seep out, like a slow-moving fog, into the small, tight-knit community around them. Their town was a place built on the illusion of privacy, a web of picket fences and closed doors that concealed the small secrets and private griefs of its inhabitants. It was a place where everyone believed they knew their neighbors, but soon they would learn that Alden Crowe knew them better. Beatrice, a widow who lived in the house next door, was a woman who tended to her garden with a ferocity that bordered on obsession. It was her only solace since the passing of her husband 3 years prior. One afternoon, while kneeling in the dirt and pulling weeds from around her prized rose bushes, she muttered to herself under her breath. She spoke of her frustration with the Reverend's wife, who she felt had slighted her at the church social the previous Sunday. It was a petty, bitter monologue, laced with a loneliness that she would never dare speak aloud to another living soul. Her words were for the soil and the roses, a private poison she was drawing from her heart. Later that day, she was returning from the general store when she saw Alden sitting on his front porch, idly drawing patterns in the dust with a stick. As she passed, he looked up at her, his pale eyes seeming to see right through her. In a quiet, conversational tone, he told her that the Reverend's wife had not meant to ignore her, but that her mind was preoccupied with her own daughter's illness. He repeated a phrase from Beatrice's own silent, furious muttering, a specific, venomous turn of phrase that made the woman stop dead in her tracks. A sharp, audible gasp escaped her lips. Her hand flew to her chest, her knuckles white. She stared at the boy, her face a mask of disbelief and terror. He had not just guessed at her feelings, he had plucked the very words from her mind. Beatrice turned and fled, not even making it to her own door, before she veered into the street and hurried towards the home of another neighbor, her heart hammering against her ribs. The secret was out. The whispers began to spread through the town like a contagion. Beatrice's story was initially met with skepticism, but it was quickly followed by another, and then another. Phineas, a blacksmith who was struggling with a gambling debt he had managed to keep hidden from his wife, was walking home one evening, his mind consumed with worry. The exact figure, a sum of $42, rolled over and over in his thoughts, a heavy stone in his gut. As he passed the Crowe property, he saw Alden by the fence, watching a column of ants march across a log. Without turning his head, the boy spoke the number aloud. $42, he said, was a great deal of money to owe Mr. Abernathy. Phineas felt the world tilt on its axis. He had never spoken that name or that number to anyone. He ran the rest of the way home, his breath catching in his throat, locking the door behind him as if he could shut out the boy's impossible knowledge. The incidents grew in number and specificity. A woman who harbored a secret vanity about her youthful appearance was met with Alden's quiet observation that her hair was not as red as it used to be. A man who was planning to sell his failing farm without telling his family was confronted by the boy asking where they would go after the land was gone. These were not childish guesses or cruel taunts. They were delivered with a strange, detached empathy, as if Alden were merely a conduit for information that flowed through him from some unseen source. The community's perception of the boy shifted with terrifying speed. The quiet, stone-collecting child was now viewed as an anomaly, a vessel for something that did not belong in their orderly world. People began to cross the street to avoid walking past the Crowe house. Mothers would hustle their children indoors when they saw him playing in his yard. The friendly nods and greetings that had once been exchanged with Josiah and Alara were replaced with guarded stares and hushed conversations that ceased the moment they drew near. The family's world began to shrink, the walls of their home becoming the borders of a self-imposed exile. The quiet unease that had started with a child's tilted head in a sunlit yard had now blossomed into a communal fear, a suspicion that was taking root in the heart of the town. The whispers were no longer just about Alden, they were about what was listening through him. The fragile boundary between private thought and public knowledge, once the bedrock of communal life, had begun to dissolve. In its place, a pervasive, chilling transparency took hold, and at its center was a 10-year-old boy. The town's fear, once a collection of isolated whispers, was now coalescing into a singular, oppressive presence. It was a fear that thrived not in darkness, but in the open air of the market square and within the consecrated walls of the church. Public spaces, where lives intersected with a comforting degree of anonymity, were transformed into arenas of potential exposure. Every citizen harbored some small, hidden shame, some private guilt or unspoken resentment, and they now walked their days with the unnerving sense that their innermost thoughts were no longer their own. Alden Crowe had become a walking repository of their secrets. His quiet gaze now felt like an indictment, and his silence was more terrifying than any accusation. The community, which had once defined itself by its shared values and mutual support, was beginning to fracture under the weight of what the boy might hear next. Tolerance had worn thin, replaced by a raw, primal instinct to identify and excise the source of their collective unease. The question was no longer what was wrong with the boy, but what the boy was doing to them. Silas ran the town's general store, a place that was more than a commercial enterprise. It was the hub of social life, a nexus of news and gossip. The air inside was a complex tapestry of scents: freshly ground coffee, cured tobacco, brine from the pickle barrel, and the dry, dusty smell of milled flour. Light from the two large front windows struggled to pierce the interior gloom, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air and glinting off the glass jars of penny candy that lined the counter. Silas himself was a man who cultivated an image of unimpeachable honesty. He was a deacon at the church, a member of the town council, and his pronouncements on matters of morality were delivered with a gravity that few dared to question. Yet, for the past 6 months, Silas had been engaged in a small, systematic deception. He had been skimming pennies from transactions involving the bulk sale of grain, a practice known in the trade as short waiting. It was a minor theft, an almost imperceptible betrayal of the trust his customers placed in him, but it had amounted to a secret hoard of several dollars, a sum he kept hidden in a loose floorboard beneath his bed. The guilt was a constant, low-grade hum in the back of his mind, a dissonance that clashed with his public persona. One Tuesday morning, Elara entered the store to purchase flour and salt, holding Alden by the hand. The store was busy, with 3 other women waiting their turn, their conversation a low murmur of domestic concerns. Silas greeted Elara with his customary professional warmth, his smile a well-practiced fixture. He measured out the flour, his movements efficient and familiar. As he was calculating the total, his thumb resting ever so slightly on the scale to tip it in his favor, Alden spoke. His voice was not loud, but it cut through the ambient chatter with the clarity of a bell. He told his mother that Mr. Silas did not need to press the scale so hard. He said that the coins in the floorboard already made enough of a sound when he walked. The store fell into an immediate, profound silence. The only sound was the soft whisper of flour settling in its sack. Silas froze, his hand still on the scale. The blood drained from his face, leaving behind a waxy, pallid sheen. He stared at Alden, his mouth opening and closing silently, like a fish gasping for air. The other women in the store exchanged wide, knowing glances. They had all, at one time or another, felt the sting of a purchase that seemed to cost a little more than it should have. Alden's words were not just an accusation, they were a confirmation of 100 tiny, unvoiced suspicions. Silas finally managed to stammer a denial, his voice a hoarse croak. He insisted that the boy was unwell, that he was spouting nonsense, but his trembling hands and the sweat bejeweling his brow told a different story. Elara, mortified and terrified, quickly paid the correct amount, grabbed her son's arm, and fled the store, the silent, judgmental stares of the other patrons burning into her back. The event became a cornerstone of the town's growing legend of Alden Crowe. It was proof that his affliction, or his gift, was not limited to revealing the secrets of the heart, but the hidden sins of commerce as well. Silas's reputation was shattered in an instant, not by a formal accusation, but by the quiet, factual pronouncement of a child who should have known nothing. The spiritual life of the community was anchored by the old stone church that stood on a small hill overlooking the town. Its spire was the first thing travelers saw upon approach, and the last thing they saw upon departure. Its interior was a place of solemnity and reverence, the air cool and still, smelling of aged wood, beeswax, and the faint, metallic tang of the communion wine. The light, filtered through panes of colored glass depicting scenes from the scriptures, painted the wooden pews in hues of deep blue, blood red, and ethereal gold. For the faithful, it was a sanctuary, a place where the soul could find refuge from the cares of the world, a place where secrets could be unburdened in the sanctity of the confessional, heard only by the priest and by God. Adeline was a woman whose piety was as much a part of her identity as the color of her eyes. She attended every service, her prayers fervent, and her charity well known. But recently, a profound and terrifying doubt had taken root in her heart, a crisis of faith so deep it felt like a physical illness. Following the death of her infant son from fever the previous winter, she found she could no longer feel the presence of God. Her prayers felt like words spoken into an empty room. This secret apostasy filled her with a shame more profound than any sin of the flesh. One Saturday afternoon, she sought out Reverend Michael for confession. In the enclosed darkness of the confessional, her voice choked with tears. She admitted her spiritual desolation. She confessed that she believed God had abandoned her, that his silence was a punishment she could not comprehend. Reverend Michael offered her what comfort he could, prescribing prayers and penance, his words a balm on her raw and wounded spirit. She left feeling a sliver of relief, believing her terrible secret was now safely locked away in the heart of the church. The following morning, the congregation gathered for the Sunday service. The sermon was on the nature of faith in the face of suffering. As the parishioners filed out of the church after the final hymn, blinking in the bright morning sun, Adeline felt a light touch on her sleeve. She turned to find Alden Crowe standing beside her. He looked up at her, his expression unreadable, and told her that God was not silent because he was angry. He said that he was silent because he was listening. He then repeated the exact phrase she had used in the confessional, a unique and desperate turn of words describing the emptiness she felt in her soul. A wave of vertigo washed over Adeline. The world seemed to recede, the cheerful greetings of her fellow parishioners fading into a distant roar. This was not like the other incidents. This was a violation of a sacred trust, a breaching of a line that was meant to be inviolable. The confessional was a fortress, and this child had walked through its walls as if they were not there. A strangled cry escaped her lips. She stumbled backward, away from the boy, her face a mask of spiritual horror. She turned and ran, not toward her home, but away from the church, away from the holy ground that had failed to protect her. She fled down the hill, her bonnet askew, her sobs tearing at the peaceful Sunday morning air. Reverend Michael witnessed the entire exchange from the church doorway. He saw the look on Adeline's face, a look he had only ever seen on the faces of the truly damned. He had heard Alden's words, and he knew, with a certainty that made his own faith tremble, that those were the words Adeline had spoken to him, and only to him, in the sight of God. The fear in the town had now found a new, more terrible dimension. It had moved beyond the exposure of petty thefts and hidden resentments. It had trespassed into the realm of the soul. The scattered incidents now wove themselves into a coherent and terrifying narrative. The townspeople, seeking a framework to understand the incomprehensible, reached for the old familiar vocabulary of fear. The words witchcraft and possession, once relics of a more superstitious age, were resurrected in hushed tones over dinner tables and across fences. They whispered that the boy was a vessel, that his eyes were not his own, that he was an open doorway through which some unholy intelligence was peering into their world. They began to see omens in the mundane: a dead bird on a doorstep, a sudden storm, a quart of milk that soured overnight. All of it was connected somehow to the quiet boy in the Crowe house. The fear was a poison that changed the very texture of daily life. Laughter in the streets became subdued. Conversations were kept brief and superficial. People began to guard their own thoughts, as if a stray, unkind thought might be plucked from the air and spoken aloud by the child. They imagined their secret vanities, their hidden jealousies, their private griefs, all laid bare for public consumption. Alden became a pariah, and by extension, so did his parents. Josiah found that his carpentry jobs dried up, his neighbors suddenly finding excuses to hire men from the next town over. Alara was met with a wall of silence at the market, the women turning their backs as she approached. Their isolation was absolute. They were marooned in their own home, custodians of a phenomenon that was dismantling their lives and terrorizing their neighbors. The core question whispered in every home was no longer one of pity for the family, but one of survival for the community. Is Alden Crowe cursed, gifted, or something else entirely? And more importantly, what were they going to do about him? The simmering paranoia was reaching a boiling point. The social fabric of the town, woven from threads of trust and discretion, was unraveling. A consensus was forming, a silent agreement that this could not be allowed to continue. The fear had become too great to be managed by shunning and whispers alone. It demanded intervention, it demanded authority, and so, a small delegation of the town's most prominent citizens, led by a disgraced Silas and a deeply troubled Reverend Michael, made the decision to walk to the small office of the local constable. They went to report a crime, though they could not name the law that had been broken. They went to seek a resolution to a problem that had no name, convinced that the quiet, 10-year-old boy who heard too much was a threat that had to be contained. The intervention of formal authority did not arrive with the force of a storm, but with the quiet, deliberate steps of a single man. Constable Theron was a broad-shouldered individual whose presence usually inspired a sense of order and finality. He was a man accustomed to the tangible world of broken locks, stolen livestock, and disputes between neighbors that could be settled with a firm word and an appeal to common sense. He approached the Crowe house not as an inquisitor, but as a groundskeeper tasked with rooting out a particularly stubborn weed. The delegation of townsfolk had presented their case with a fervor that bordered on panic, speaking of stolen thoughts and violated secrets. Theron had listened patiently, his expression impassive, though inwardly he dismissed their claims as the product of small-town superstition and collective anxiety. He had a young daughter of his own, a girl prone to flights of fancy, and he suspected this was merely a case of a child's overactive imagination that had been allowed to fester. He believed a simple, stern conversation would be enough to put an end to the matter, to restore the familiar and predictable rhythms of the town he was sworn to protect. He walked up the path to the Crowe home on a morning that was crisp with the promise of autumn, the sun casting long, sharp shadows across the yard where Alden's stone spirals lay undisturbed, like the fossilized remains of some forgotten ritual. The atmosphere inside the house was thick with a palpable tension. Josiah and Alara met the constable at the door, their faces etched with a mixture of fear and a desperate flickering hope. They looked like people who had not slept soundly for many weeks, their movements strained, their voices thin and reedy. Theron stepped into their small parlor, his bulk seeming to diminish the size of the room. He removed his hat, his gaze sweeping over the modest, tidy space. It was a home of simple, hard-working people, not a den of witchcraft or devilry. He sat at their small wooden table, the chair creaking under his weight, and began his inquiry in a calm, methodical tone. He asked them to recount the events, to explain the source of the town's distress. Josiah spoke first, his words halting and uncertain. He tried to describe what was happening to his son, but the language of ordinary life failed him. He spoke of conversations repeated, of secrets unveiled, of knowledge that had no logical origin. Alara added her own testimony, her voice trembling as she described the incident at the general store, her shame and terror still fresh. To the constable, a man who dealt in facts and evidence, their story sounded like a rambling, incoherent confession of parental failure, a tale of a child allowed to run wild with lies and mischief. He listened, his skepticism hardening with every sentence. He concluded they were either complicit in a cruel prank or had lost control of their own household. He then asked to speak with the boy alone. Alden was brought into the room. He was just a child, small for his age, with pale, serious eyes that seemed to take in everything without judgment. He was not fidgeting or fearful. He simply stood before the constable, his hands clasped behind his back, and waited. Theron softened his voice, attempting to build a rapport. He asked Alden about his games, about his friends, about school. Alden answered each question politely and directly. There was no sign of the malevolent trickster the townspeople had described. The constable then steered the conversation toward the accusations. He asked Alden if he had been saying things to upset the neighbors. He asked him if he understood that spreading stories could cause a great deal of trouble. Alden listened patiently and then replied. He said he did not mean to cause trouble. He said he only repeated what he heard. The constable pressed him, asking him how he could possibly hear conversations that took place behind closed doors. Alden tilted his head, the same gesture his mother had seen in the yard weeks before, as if considering the question from a strange new angle. He told the constable that the words were simply there, like the buzzing of a fly in a quiet room. He could not explain it any better than that. Theron sighed, his patience wearing thin. He decided to try a different tactic to catch the boy in a lie. He reached into his own pocket, his fingers closing around the smooth, cool metal of his pocket watch. He told Alden that he had a secret, something he had not told anyone. He challenged the boy to tell him what it was. It was a simple test, a way to expose the child's bluff and bring this whole affair to a close. Alden was silent for a long moment, his eyes fixed on a point just past the constable's shoulder. Then, in his flat, uninflected voice, he spoke. He said that the watch did not work anymore. He said that the spring had broken yesterday evening when it was dropped on the stone hearth. He added that the constable's wife, Maria, had told him not to worry, that they would have it fixed when the jeweler visited from the next county. Every detail was precise. Every detail was correct. Constable Theron felt a profound and deeply unsettling chill creep up his spine. The watch had indeed broken the previous night. He had not even told his own deputy. The conversation with his wife had taken place in the privacy of their bedroom, their words spoken in hushed tones. The blood rushed in his ears, and for a moment, the solid, predictable world he inhabited seemed to shimmer and warp. He looked at the boy, truly looked at him, and saw not a mischievous child, but an unnerving, placid vessel of impossible knowledge. He abruptly stood, the legs of the chair scraping harshly against the floorboards. He informed Josiah and Alara that there was no evidence of any crime. The boy had committed no act of theft, no assault, no verifiable slander that could be prosecuted. The law, he explained, was not equipped to deal with such matters. He left the house without another word, his stride stiff, his mind reeling. He had come to solve a problem and had instead come face to face with a mystery that shook his understanding of the world. The law had found its limit. With the constable's retreat, the town's hope for a swift resolution turned to the other pillar of rational authority, medicine. If Alden's condition was not a matter for the law, then it must be a sickness of the mind or the body, a malady to be diagnosed and, hopefully, cured. The community's fear, now mingled with a new clinical curiosity, fell upon Dr. Ephraim. He was the town's only physician, a man in his late 40s who prided himself on his modern, scientific approach. His office was a testament to this belief, a clean, well-lit space that smelled sharply of carbolic acid and rubbing alcohol. On his desk lay an array of gleaming brass and steel instruments, tools of precision and logic that he believed could unlock the secrets of any human ailment. He held a deep-seated contempt for superstition and viewed the rumors about the Crowe boy as a lamentable outbreak of rural hysteria. He agreed to see Alden, not because he believed there was anything truly wrong with him, but because he saw it as his duty to quell the town's anxieties with a firm, rational diagnosis. He was a man who believed that every ghost could be explained away by a draft, and every premonition by an undigested bit of beef. Josiah and Alara brought Alden to the doctor's office on a gray, overcast afternoon. The mood was somber, heavy with the weight of their last hope. Dr. Ephraim greeted them with a cool, professional detachment. He led Alden into the examination room, a sterile, white-walled chamber dominated by a black leather examination table. The contrast between the cold, clinical environment and the strange, intuitive nature of Alden's alleged abilities was stark. The doctor began his examination with a methodical thoroughness. He checked Alden's reflexes with a small rubber mallet, peered into his throat with a polished depressor, and listened to his heart and lungs with a cold stethoscope. Alden submitted to each test with a quiet, passive compliance. He was a specimen under a microscope, an object to be measured and categorized. The doctor found him to be in perfect physical health. He then turned his attention to the boy's hearing. This, he believed, was the crux of the matter. He suspected the boy possessed an unusually acute sense of hearing, which, when combined with a vivid imagination, could account for the stories. He produced a set of tuning forks, striking them one by one and holding them at varying distances from Alden's ears. He whispered words from across the room, his voice barely audible. He performed every test he knew. The results were undeniable. Alden's hearing was not just normal, it was exceptionally sharp. He could discern sounds at a threshold far beyond that of an average person. For the doctor, this was a satisfying, if incomplete, piece of the puzzle. Having confirmed the boy's physical state, Ephraim moved on to the psychological. He sat facing Alden, his posture that of a patient interrogator. He asked the boy about the voices, using a gentle, patronizing tone. He inquired if Alden knew the difference between things he truly heard and things he imagined. Alden's response was, as always, simple and direct. He told the doctor that there was no difference. The sounds were just there. The doctor, convinced he was dealing with a deeply confused child, tried to lead him. He suggested that perhaps Alden was lonely, that he invented conversations to keep himself company. Alden considered this and then shook his head, stating that he was never alone. The doctor leaned in, sensing a breakthrough. He asked who was with him. Alden replied that the voices were with him. It was a maddeningly circular conversation, a loop of logic that Ephraim's scientific mind could not penetrate. Frustrated, the doctor made one final attempt to ground the boy in reality. He gestured to a thick, leather-bound medical textbook on his shelf. He told Alden that the book was filled with knowledge, with the secrets of the human body. He then thought to himself, a private, fleeting thought, about a specific passage he had been studying the night before, a complex description of the auditory nerve pathways. It was a subject that fascinated him, a frontier of medical understanding. He held the thought in his mind, a silent challenge. Alden looked at the book, then back at the doctor. He said that the book was wrong about the small bone in the ear. He said it did not just carry the sound, it changed it. He then used a precise, anatomical term that Ephraim had read in that very passage, a term no 10-year-old boy in their town could possibly have known. Dr. Ephraim felt a jolt, as if he had touched an exposed electrical wire. For a fleeting second, the sterile certainty of his world fractured. He stared at the boy, his clinical detachment evaporating, replaced by a raw, intellectual shock. It was impossible. It defied every law of nature and medicine he held sacred. But the moment of uncertainty passed as quickly as it had come. His mind, trained to seek rational explanations, recoiled from the abyss of the unknown. He found the only explanation that his worldview would allow, the only label that could contain this inexplicable phenomenon and render it harmless. He picked up his pen and on a fresh sheet of paper wrote his official diagnosis. He declared that Alden Crowe was suffering from a severe case of hysteria, compounded by an audial sensitivity that led to auditory hallucinations. He explained to Josiah and Alara that their son's mind was creating elaborate fictions, convincing itself that it was hearing things that were not there. He recommended rest, a quiet environment, and a firm refusal to indulge the boy's fantasies. He spoke the words with the full weight of his medical authority, a pronouncement from the altar of science. For Josiah and Alara, the diagnosis was a final, devastating blow. The law had declared their son blameless but offered no help. Now, science had declared him insane, dismissing their terrifying reality as a shared delusion. They were left completely and utterly alone, abandoned by the very institutions that were meant to provide answers and protection. They left the doctor's office not with a cure, but with a label that isolated them even further, a clinical judgment that silenced their truth more effectively than any threat. They were now the parents of a hysterical child, and in the eyes of the world, their nightmare was nothing more than a figment of a diseased imagination. With the twin pillars of law and science having crumbled into dust, offering no foundation upon which to rebuild their shattered lives, Josiah and Alara found themselves adrift in a sea of inexplicable terror. The constable's verdict of innocence had provided no peace, and the doctor's diagnosis of hysteria felt like a profound betrayal, a clinical dismissal of a reality that was becoming more vivid and menacing with each passing day. The town, armed with the doctor's official pronouncement, now viewed the Crowes not just with fear, but with a kind of pitying contempt. They were the parents of a mentally unwell child, a family whose private tragedy was seen as a source of public disruption. The whispers did not cease. They merely changed their vocabulary, replacing words like witchcraft with terms like madness and delusion. For the family, this new label was a heavier burden, for it implied that the horror was not an external force acting upon them, but a flaw originating from within. Left with no secular recourse, they turned, as a last resort, to the one remaining institution that claimed dominion over the unseen world. They turned to faith. They hoped that where the temporal powers of the state and the rational inquiries of medicine had failed, the spiritual authority of the church might prevail. It was a desperate, final appeal to a higher power, a plea for an exorcism of either the spirit or the mind, whichever was plaguing their son. Reverend Michael had been avoiding the Crowe family since the disturbing incident with Adeline outside the church. He was a man of sincere, if somewhat fragile, faith. His understanding of the world was built upon the bedrock of Scripture, a collection of stories and laws that, for the most part, provided a clear distinction between the holy and the profane, the natural and the miraculous. Alden Crowe, however, did not fit neatly into any of his theological categories. The boy was not a blasphemer, nor did he exhibit the violent theatrical signs of demonic possession described in the old texts. His affliction was a quiet, insidious thing, a subtle perversion of the natural order that was far more unsettling than any overt display of evil. The Reverend's own encounter with Alden's ability had left a deep and abiding crack in his own certainty. Adeline's confession had been a sacred trust, a secret shared between a penitent soul, her priest, and her God. Alden's casual repetition of her words felt like a sacrilegious intrusion, a violation of a spiritual space that was supposed to be inviolable. He harbored a deep, unvoiced fear that what was speaking through the boy was not of God, yet he could not bring himself to believe it was of the devil either. It was something other, something that his seminary training had not prepared him for. When Josiah appeared at the rectory one evening, his face a mask of exhaustion and despair, the Reverend knew he could no longer stand aside. He agreed to visit the Crowe house, to offer prayers, and to confront whatever entity had taken root in their home. He did so not with the righteous confidence of a holy warrior, but with the profound trepidation of a man walking into a darkness he did not understand. He arrived at the house just after dusk, carrying a small, worn leather satchel containing a Bible, a wooden crucifix, and a vial of holy water. The air was cool and still, and the setting sun had painted the western sky in bruised shades of purple and orange. The Crowe home, which had once seemed so ordinary, now appeared to the Reverend as a place apart, isolated from the rest of the town by the invisible quarantine of fear. He was ushered into Alden's small attic room. It was a sparse space, furnished with only a narrow bed, a small wooden chest, and a single chair. The slanted ceiling was low, creating a sense of confinement. A single candle flickered on a small table, its flame casting long, dancing shadows that seemed to writhe and cling to the walls. The atmosphere was heavy, charged with a silence that felt more like a presence than an absence of sound. Alden was sitting on his bed, his legs crossed, his hands resting in his lap. He watched the Reverend enter with a calm, unnerving placidity, his expression revealing neither fear nor curiosity. He simply observed, as if he had been expecting him. Ilara and Josiah stood huddled in the doorway, their faces pale in the candlelight, their presence a silent, desperate prayer in itself. They were spectators at this final, spiritual tribunal. Reverend Michael began his ritual. He opened his Bible to the Gospel of John, his voice steady as he began to read the familiar, comforting words of the Scripture. He spoke of the light that shines in the darkness, of the Word made flesh. The ancient verses, which had brought comfort to countless souls for centuries, seemed to fall flat in the small, oppressive room. The words hung in the air for a moment before being swallowed by the profound silence. Alden remained motionless, his gaze unwavering. The Reverend then took out the crucifix, holding it aloft. He began to pray, his voice rising in volume and intensity, calling upon the name of God to cast out any unclean spirit that might be present. He spoke of the power of Christ to heal the sick and to command the forces of darkness. It was a prayer he had recited many times, a bulwark of faith against the anxieties of the unknown. As he was in the midst of a particularly fervent passage, Alden spoke. His voice was not loud, but it possessed a strange, resonant quality that seemed to fill the room, cutting through the Reverend's prayer as if it were nothing. He did not address the Reverend directly. He spoke to the air, his eyes still fixed on that empty point in space. He said that the Reverend's older brother, Thomas, forgave him. He said that Thomas knew that he had not meant to let go of the rope. The Reverend's prayer died in his throat, a strangled, guttural sound. His arm, holding the crucifix, fell to his side. His face, which had been flushed with spiritual fervor, turned a deathly shade of white. 40 years prior, when he was just a boy of 8, he and his older brother, Thomas, had been playing near an abandoned well. Thomas had dared to be lowered into the darkness on a rope. The Reverend, small and struggling, had lost his grip. His brother had fallen. It was a secret he had carried his entire life, a private, crushing guilt that he had never confessed to another living soul, not even in his own prayers. It was a memory buried so deep that he himself rarely dared to look upon it. The crucifix slipped from the Reverend's trembling fingers and clattered onto the wooden floor. The sound was unnaturally loud in the sudden, absolute silence. He stared at Alden, his heart pounding in his chest, a cold sweat breaking out on his forehead. The boy's eyes were not cruel or mocking. They were simply knowing. It was not an accusation. It was a statement of fact, delivered from a place beyond human understanding. In that moment, the Reverend understood. This was not a sickness. This was not a child's fantasy. And it was not the simple, brutish evil he had read about in his books. This was something far more ancient, far more subtle. It was an intelligence that did not rage or threaten, but simply saw and spoke. It wielded truth as its weapon, and against such a weapon, his faith felt like a shield of paper. He backed away from the bed, his movements clumsy and uncoordinated. He stumbled out of the room, pushing past the stunned and horrified parents in the doorway. He did not stop to retrieve his Bible or his crucifix. He fled down the narrow attic stairs and out of the house, into the relative safety of the night. He did not slow his pace until he reached the sanctuary of his own rectory, where he barred the door and spent the remainder of the night in a state of spiritual and existential terror. His faith had been tested not by a demon, but by a quiet, undeniable truth spoken by a 10-year-old boy. And in that test, his faith had been found wanting. The news of the Reverend's panicked flight spread through the town with the speed of a wildfire. His retreat, more than any other event, solidified the community's darkest fears. The clergy, their last line of defense against the forces of the unknown, had been routed. If the man of God was powerless against what resided in Alden Crowe, then what hope was there for ordinary people? The rumors that had once been whispered in private were now spoken openly, taking on the weight of established fact. The boy was no longer seen as a troubled child, but as a vessel for something profoundly alien, something not human. The townspeople's fear was now laced with a kind of grim resignation. They no longer sought to understand or to cure. They sought only to isolate. The Crowe family was now completely and irrevocably shunned. They had become lepers in their own community, their home, a place of contagion. They were left alone with their son, in a house that now felt like a tomb, with a presence that faith could not name and science could not explain. The final attempt at intervention had not brought salvation. It had brought only a deeper and more terrifying confirmation of their isolation. The quiet, candlelit ritual had turned into a confrontation that had shattered a priest's soul and extinguished the last flicker of hope for the beleaguered family. They were now truly on their own, trapped with the boy who heard everything and the silent, listening presence that spoke through him. The failure of the Reverend's intervention marked a turning point in the ordeal of the Crowe family. It was the final closing of a door, the last appeal to an outside world that had proven itself both powerless and unwilling to help. The authorities of man and God had retreated, leaving Josiah and Alara in a state of profound and terrifying isolation. Their home was no longer a sanctuary. It had become their prison, a small island of dread in a sea of communal hostility. The days grew shorter, the autumn air turning sharp and cold, mirroring the chill that had settled permanently in their hearts. They moved through their home like ghosts, their conversations reduced to hushed, necessary exchanges. The silence in the house was a living thing, thick and watchful, broken only by the mundane sounds of their sparse existence and the increasingly frequent whispers from Alden's room. The nature of Alden's affliction was also changing, evolving from something purely auditory into something that demanded a physical vessel. The voices, it seemed, were no longer content to simply be heard by the boy. They now sought a more permanent form of expression, a tangible record of their incessant, invisible chatter. The quiet, passive listener was becoming a scribe. The discovery was made by Alara on a bleak Tuesday afternoon. She had gone up to Alden's attic room to bring him a small meal, a task she had come to dread. The room was always cold, even when a fire was lit in the small stove, and the air within it felt strangely thin and static. For the past several days, Alden had been spending nearly all his time in the room, refusing to come downstairs. She had heard him moving about, the soft scratching of a chair, the rustle of paper, and a low, continuous muttering, as if he were holding a conversation with a multitude of unseen companions. She had tried to dismiss it, to hold on to the doctor's diagnosis of hysteria like a talisman, but the memory of the Reverend's terrified flight made it impossible. As she pushed open the door, she was met with a scene that stopped her breath in her chest. The room had been transformed. Dozens of sheets of paper were strewn across the floor, the bed, and the small wooden chest. They were covered, from edge to edge, in Alden's childish, slightly slanted handwriting. It was an ocean of ink, a chaotic and overwhelming display of written words. Alden himself sat at his small table, his back to her, a piece of charcoal clutched in his small hand. He was writing with a feverish, obsessive intensity, his hand flying across the page. He did not seem to be composing thoughts of his own, but rather transcribing a dictation that was being delivered at a furious pace. He was so engrossed in his task that he did not even register her presence in the doorway. Alara stood frozen for a long moment, her mind struggling to process what she was seeing. The sheer volume of the writing was staggering. She took a tentative step into the room, the papers crunching softly under her feet. She bent down and picked one up. It was a sheet of wrapping paper from the general store, its surface covered in a dense block of text. Her eyes scanned the words, and a cold wave of nausea washed over her. The page contained a detailed and verbatim account of a heated argument that had taken place 2 nights before between the blacksmith, Phineas, and his wife. It was a deeply personal and bitter exchange, filled with accusations of gambling and deceit. It included specific figures, dates, and names that Alden could not possibly have known. She dropped the page as if it were on fire and snatched up another. This one, written on the back of an old almanac page, detailed the private, grief-stricken prayers of the widow Beatrice, her lonely and desperate pleas to her deceased husband. Alara's hands began to tremble. She moved through the room in a daze, picking up page after page. Each one was a fragment of a secret life, a captured moment of private thought or conversation from someone in the town. There was a farmer's desperate calculation of his mounting debts, a young woman's tearful confession of a forbidden love, a shopkeeper's greedy and envious thoughts about a rival. It was a tapestry of the town's collective unconscious, a raw and uncensored transcript of its hopes, its fears, its sins, and its sorrows. When Josiah came home, she met him at the door, her face ashen, a handful of the terrible pages clutched in her hand. She led him upstairs without a word. He stood in the doorway of his son's room, his gaze sweeping over the same scene of obsessive transcription. Alden had not moved. He was still writing, the soft, rhythmic scratching of the charcoal the only sound in the room. Josiah, a practical man who had always grounded himself in the tangible world of wood and steel, felt the last vestiges of his rational skepticism crumble into dust. This was not hysteria. Hysteria could not produce this level of specific, verifiable detail. This was proof. This was cold, undeniable evidence of the reality they were facing. He picked up a page, his own hands shaking now. He recognized the words immediately. It was a conversation he himself had had with another carpenter just the day before, a private discussion about a flaw in a building design, a secret they had agreed to keep between themselves to protect their reputation. Seeing his own private words, his own thoughts, written in his son's hand was a violation so profound it felt like a physical blow. The horror was no longer something he could try to reason away or hope would simply fade. It was here, in black and white, written on scraps of paper that littered the floor of his own home. This written evidence was a new and terrible escalation. Alden was no longer just a passive receiver. He was an active and terrifyingly accurate chronicler of the town's secret heart. The existence of the written voices could not be contained within the walls of the Crowe house. In a moment of desperate, last-ditch hope for understanding, Josiah took a single page, the one detailing the blacksmith's argument, and went to see Phineas. He did not know what he hoped to accomplish. Perhaps he sought a witness, someone else who could validate the impossible truth of what was happening. He found Phineas in his forge, the air thick with the smell of coal, smoke, and hot metal. With trembling hands, Josiah presented the sheet of paper. Phineas read it, his face slowly losing its color, his usual bluster and confidence draining away like sand through a sieve. He recognized his own words, his wife's words, the raw and painful intimacy of their private battle laid bare on the page. He looked at Josiah not with anger, but with a wide-eyed, primal fear. He did not ask how this was possible. He simply handed the paper back and turned away, refusing to speak another word. But the damage was done. Phineas, in his terror and shock, told his wife. His wife told her sister. The sister told her neighbor. Within a day, the story of the written conversations had spread through the town, not as a rumor, but as a confirmed and terrifying fact. The fear in the community now transformed into a final, unbreachable wall of ostracism. The villagers no longer saw Alden as a source of unsettling knowledge, but as a living record of their innermost lives. They imagined their own secrets, their own private moments, transcribed in his childish hand, stored in that cold attic room. The possibility of exposure was no longer a fleeting, verbal threat. It was a permanent, written record. The town reacted with a collective, instinctual act of self-preservation. They severed all ties with the Crowe family. No one would sell them goods. No one would speak to them. When they were forced to walk through town, a visible path would clear around them, people turning their heads, mothers pulling their children close. The family was utterly and completely alone, shunned by the very community they had once been a part of. The ink-stained pages had become the final, irrefutable proof of their otherness. The horror was no longer ambiguous. It had been given a physical form, a cold and undeniable reality that could be held in trembling hands. The private had become unbearably public, and in the face of such a violation, the only defense was to treat the source of that violation as if it did not exist. For the Crowe family, the fear of the unknown had been replaced by the certainty of their isolation. They had been cast out, left to confront the source of the written voices on their own, with no hope of help or understanding from the world outside their door. The final act of the Crowe family's tragedy was not marked by a climactic confrontation or a dramatic resolution. It was a slow, quiet descent into a state of resigned despair, a surrender to the suffocating reality of their circumstances. The community's shunning was absolute, a wall of silence and averted gazes that was more effective than any physical barrier. They were exiles in their own home, their existence acknowledged only by the whispers that trailed in their wake. The world had shrunk to the four walls of their house, and within those walls, the relentless presence of the voices held dominion. Josiah and Alara, stripped of every external support system, were left with only each other and the terrifying, unknowable thing that their son had become. The question of what to do, which had tormented them for months, now had only one possible, heartbreaking answer. They could no longer fight the phenomenon, nor could they hope to understand it. All that was left was to contain it. The decision was not made in a single, tearful conversation, but in a series of shared, unspoken glances, in the heavy silence that filled the spaces between their meager meals. It was a conclusion reached not through logic, but through the pure exhaustion of their souls. If they could not silence the voices Alden heard, they could at least try to silence the world around him. The confinement began subtly. At first, they simply stopped encouraging Alden to go outside. The yard, once his sanctuary of patterned stones, was now a stage for the town's hostile stares. Then, they began to keep the front and back doors bolted even during the day. The final step was the most difficult. One evening, after Alden had fallen into a fitful sleep at the kitchen table, his hand still clutching a piece of charcoal, Josiah lifted his son into his arms and carried him up the narrow stairs to the attic room. He placed him gently on the bed, and for a long moment stood watching him, his heart a cold, heavy knot in his chest. This was his son, the boy he had taught to fish, the boy who had once filled their home with a quiet, gentle presence. Now, he was a vessel for a ceaseless torrent of words, a mystery that had consumed their lives. With a deep, shuddering breath, Josiah pulled the door closed, and for the first time, turned the key in the lock. The soft click of the bolt sliding into place was a sound of absolute finality. It was an act of love and of terror, a desperate attempt to protect their child from a world that feared him, and to protect themselves from the oral chaos he channeled. From that day on, Alden's world was reduced to the sparse confines of his attic room. They brought him his meals on a tray, which they left outside his door. They collected the scattered pages of his transcriptions, storing them in a large wooden chest as if they were holy, or perhaps cursed, relics. Life in the house settled into a grim, monastic routine. The silence that had once been punctuated by Alden's unsettling pronouncements was now a constant, oppressive presence in the lower floors of the house. But it was a deceptive silence. Often, in the dead of night, as they lay sleepless in their own bed, Josiah and Alara could hear sounds from the room above, a soft, continuous whispering, the sound of Alden's voice in a low, conversational murmur. It was not the sound of a boy talking to himself. It was the cadence of a person engaged in a lively, multifaceted conversation. Sometimes, they would hear a faint, soft laugh, a sound so alien in their joyless home that it was more chilling than any scream. Driven by a mixture of parental concern and a morbid need to know, Alara would sometimes creep up the stairs and press her ear to the cold wood of the locked door. She could never make out the individual words of his whispers, but she could clearly hear the rhythm of a dialogue. She would hear him pause, as if listening to a response, and then his own voice would murmur again. On one occasion, she peered through the keyhole. The room was illuminated by a single candle, and in its flickering light, she could see her son. He was sitting on the edge of his bed, and on his face was a faint, serene smile. He was surrounded by his pages of writing, but his attention was fixed on the empty air in front of him, his head tilted slightly, his expression one of calm, contented engagement. He looked, she thought, with a surge of profound and heartbreaking horror, like a boy in the company of friends. He was not alone in that room. He was simply in the presence of company that no one else could see or hear. The silence they had tried to impose upon him had done nothing. The voices were not an intrusion from the outside world. They were with him, a part of him, an internal, invisible chorus that required no external sound to be heard. The Crowe house, with its shuttered windows and ever-present silence, became a fixture of the town's dark folklore. It ceased to be a home and became a landmark of fear, a place parents warned their children away from. It stood on the edge of town like a monument to an unresolved mystery. Neighbors who lived close enough swore that on still, quiet nights, when the wind was just right, they could hear things coming from the house. Not loud noises, but the faintest whisper of a voice, a thin, reedy sound that seemed to seep through the very walls of the building. It was, they said, the sound of a conversation that never ended. The story of Alden Crowe, the boy who heard what science couldn't silence, was no longer a current event, but a legend that was passed down in hushed tones. The central question remained, hanging over the town like a perpetual, low-lying fog. If science could not explain him, and faith could not save him, what exactly was Alden hearing, and would it ever end? The answer, it seemed, was locked away in that attic room, in the mind of a boy who sat in the darkness, smiling faintly, forever listening to the ceaseless, silent symphony of human thought. The voices had not been silenced. They had simply been given a permanent home, a quiet, shuttered house where they could speak and be heard for all time. The record on Alden Crowe is now complete. Your witness to the quiet unraveling of this forgotten history means more than you know. If you have just found our channel, subscribe to the Blasphemy Archive so you are counted among those present when the next file is unsealed. Tell us in the comments what you believe was listening through the boy.